So, what do we know about how and where the virus is transmitted, or transmitted most?
Yeah, so all of this sort of knowledge is provisional. I mean, it's not incredibly well defined, but there are some things that are pretty clear. Is that indoor transmission, on average, is higher than outdoors. It is known, for example, that the virus survives longer at low temperatures, but there's a sort of combination of temperature and humidity, so that at very low humidity and very high humidity it does well, and at intermediate humidities badly. So sort of cold, dry, places, or cold, very wet places can be bad. So, for example, people have used that evidence to say, why meat packing, what was special about meat packing industries that, several of the, outbreak events have occurred in meat packing places across the world. And then there is still considerable discussion on the relative contribution of sort of large sort of particles, after you cough, that will basically hit the ground quite not that far away from you, versus sort of aerosol transmission. And I think it would be agreed that aerosol transmission is possible, but which an aerosol transmission would mean it could obviously get much further from an individual. So that the aerosol transmission can occur, but the relative contributions of them would still be, being discussed. But the general things in terms of what most people would agree is the case would be the indoors greater transmission. Indoors obviously would be closer to people. So those would be the main factors.
Two follow-ups. Transmission via surfaces, and the research about transmission in being clustered, being very uneven. 10%, 80% of infections being 10% of transmitters.
Yeah, sure. So, with respect to surfaces, that is the sort of fomite notion, and that would relate to the temperature and humidity, those factors that relate to viral survival. So I think the general view would be that surface transmission in many situations won't be playing a major role, but in particular ones where the virus can survive a long time, and in certain situations it can. Although again, as I say, everything's provisional, but most of the so-called super spreader events, as far as I understand it, are not thought to be through surface contact. It's more through air. Certain situations where aerosol transmission is encouraged. For example, there's been outbreaks in restaurants where you knew where the people were sitting, and it was in the sort of direction of the blow from the air conditioner. But not to within the larger restaurant room. So the super spreader events have generally been attributed to survival of the virus on surfaces. The issue of the 10% of contacts, that means 10% of human contacts account for 80% of transmissions, is twofold. I mean, onefold. The first, if you like, is the extent to which a particular person is infecting other people, or is the source of infection for other people. which is what is generally is often thought about in terms of this heterogeneity, as it's referred to in transmission dynamics, and that's certainly a contribution. It's also another contribution would obviously be for the person who gets infected. The more contacts they have, the more likely they are to get infected, even if everyone was transmitting at exactly the same rate. And then there's certainly a contribution of susceptibility. I mean, one of the things that's been studied for for a century in like mice colonies, etc., is the degree to which infectious disease that mice exposed to pretty standard environments have quite different rates or different risks of becoming infected. So all those things together just make it uneven.
Right. So what do we know about which social measures reduce transmission or slow transmission?
So, I mean, anything that, leads to people being in close proximity, especially close proximity indoors, will reduce transmission.
Right.
And I mean, I guess the biggest debate on which there's, well, it doesn't really seem to be a debate so much now. I mean, people are often wearing masks going into, in shops, and it's just, and on public transport is accepted. And that's a issue of, there's not going to be randomized controlled trials of those sorts of interventions because, the sort of mask wearing might very well be protecting other people. You wearing a mask isn't necessarily protecting you that much, but it might be protecting other people from you. So you can't really you can't really randomize people to wear masks and then find out what happened to everyone that they've been in contact with, or it's very difficult to do that. So many things have to be made, I guess, on the balance of beneficial effects and potential adverse consequences.
One of the first things that many governments, including governments which did well, like South Korea did first, was close schools as major transmission hubs. Is that right?
My opinion is it was a mistake to close primary schools because of the very clear evidence of the long-term detrimental effects of that, and the highly stratified degree of the effects of closing schools. That, I mean, clearly, kids in worse social circumstances, whose parents having to do more than one job to keep afloat, etc., are going to suffer most under those circumstances. And I think that and the actual evidence for closing schools was not particularly strong. There was a systematic review came out in the Lancet really quite soon into the current pandemic, which reviewed all the prior evidence on that, but most of which was based around flu, and we've got to remember this isn't flu, and suggested the evidence wasn't strong even with flu. And what was certainly became apparent with this coronavirus, and was certainly very surprising to me, was that it wasn't multiplied through primary school kids, whereas the coronaviruses of common colds, that's are very clearly that occurs, but that doesn't occur in the case of in the case of SARS-CoV-2. The group with the lowest infection rates are primary aged kids, detected infection rates. So I think in terms of the detrimental, the detrimental effects, long-term, even not that long-term school closures are detrimental to the futures of those kids and are particularly detrimental to the futures of those kids in the least favourable social circumstances. I mean, the experience of kids in terms of the education that was provided was so massively different between, public schools were providing 7 hours a day of Zoom tuition versus a sort of email an email every so often from other schools. So in terms of increasing inequality, I think school closures are particularly detrimental.
And
some countries didn't close schools and did okay, and then other countries which did well, like Norway, people responsible for the sort of science behind and then the implementation of what happened in Norway think that school closures wasn't necessary.
One thing has been said about the very different experiences of different countries, even in Europe, is that in fact there may be not better social measures here and worse there, but such things as the level of the previous flu season.
Yeah, there was an intriguing analysis from an economist in Cambridge, which looked at the prior flu season, and the idea there is that if you have a really bad flu season, then in particular the vulnerable some will have died from flu, because there are quite a lot of deaths every year from flu, and it's got to be said that there's more deaths than get registered as being from flu because people aren't looking to particularly necessarily code flu in an elderly frail person who eventually dies of heart failure or whatever. So yeah, bad flu seasons definitely increase elderly deaths amongst the elderly, and then if they're not then around, they're not around to be infected during the arrival of COVID. That's one thing, and then a second possibility, although the actual evidence for this is not great, it's not robust, but it's an area which is actively being looked at, is that possibly through some cross active immunity, prior flu infection might increase resistance in some way to SARS-CoV-2, but I say that's not well demonstrated. Now, none of those things are convincing, I don't think. So I don't really think the evidence for this hypothesis, the prior flu hypothesis, is particularly strong. And probably one of the most surprising things to me in what's happened over the last 9 months is that we've seen only minimal evidence of what's called mortality displacement, or in a less attractive way, it's called harvesting, which is this notion that if the sick elderly die of the disease, then later on, as those people have been removed from the population, you might expect mortality rates to go down for the survivors because you've removed the sickest. And you see that in situations like when there's heat wave mortality in particular cities, you see a sort of rebound, there's spike of mortality, then there's a rebound fall. And that's just not been seen with COVID to any extent in the UK, which has, of course, had high death rates, which is particularly surprising because of the distribution of deaths. I think the how steep that is with age, I think it remains underappreciated. So, the modal age of death is well over 90 for women from COVID. That's modal age. Now, there's not even now, not huge proportion of the population survive to 90. So, but but even in that relatively small group, you're getting the absolute number of deaths peaks at an age above 90. The data aren't released in a way which allows you to do anything but estimate that. And one statistic which really differs markedly across countries is the media is comparing the age of death from coronavirus to life expectancy. Now, in the UK, the median age of death is about 85, and life expectancy is about 80, 81. In the States, the median age of death from COVID is early 70s. So it's, so in some way, I think the US still has, lower numbers of deaths per person in the population than the UK, but those deaths are occurring at younger. It's shifted down with age, which needs to be taken into consideration. Right. But that's why. But you would particularly expect this mortality displacement to be seen in the very elderly and the frail elderly, but it's not, which is a mystery. To me, right. It's a mystery.
Right. What do we know about what's needed to make a good testing, tracing, isolating operation?
So that's.
And how well would it work if it was good?
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and this is where you get the international comparisons, and people say, well, New Zealand have done this very well. Hong Kong are doing this well. Test, trace, and isolate works, or can be very effective in a situation where we have low numbers of cases. I think certainly the centralisation. Well, to be frank, it's a complete fuck up. The UK system has been a disastrous waste of huge amounts of money, as everyone knows, with this sort of centralised system. I think a combination of a local system where you have local knowledge, so if a case occurs in a particular part of the town, then people have some idea of what that environment is like, of what family structures are likely to be, etc., and would use some specific notion about how best to do the tracing in that context. So you definitely need local knowledge. So probably a combined system. I think there's some form of centralisation of information is important, and monitoring, but I think the practice needs to be local, whereas it was just made centralized. But one issue is that with the number of cases we've now grown to, the actual effectiveness of test, trace, and isolate with the number of cases we now have, it's not a plausible way of driving down infection rates. There was the possibility over summer when we went down to pretty low cases, and that just bubbled along, which means there's like reintroduction of infection in different local areas is occurring, and this sort of circulation is managing to keep the virus going. And again, the models all suggest you actually you should go down to elimination. Once the R number's below 1 and you follow it up long enough, it should just continuously disappear unless you get some form of reintroduction. But in a country of a group 60 million as opposed to 4 million, of course you will have internal mixing and reintroduction, and there's also the possibility of a few very long-term people who remain infectious for long periods of time, etc. But that was the time to do that, and that was the time when there was a possibility. I'm remain sceptical about the possibility of elimination. There would have been a possibility of elimination and maintenance in the UK, but at least if you're going to try and drive it down to the lowest possible levels, that's when you do it. But the number of cases we've got now, it's a performative act. It's doing it is performative. It's not making a useful contribution at this stage. The only useful, well, potentially useful contribution, although as I say, I think there's just too many cases to be able to do it, which relates to the issue we talked about earlier about the sort of heterogeneity of transmission, potential super spreaders, etc., is you should backwards contact trace. So if you get sick, they don't, and they think, oh, well, you must have been infected for a few days before you got sick. So they're looking at the people who you've seen. What's more sensible is to find out who you got it off, because who you got it off is likely to be someone who's spreading a lot, because very obviously, if you go backwards, you find the people who are spreading a lot. That's people liken it to the rather sad statistic that your friends have more friends than you do, because anyone's. Because we go so it's like that. So and I think that I think is being implemented in places which are maintaining low infection rates. But I don't know. I don't think there's full realization of what this means for maintaining zero COVID and what it means in terms of the countries are in different situations. So I mean, the New Zealand borders are just closed, and essentially, I mean, you have 2 week of quarantine to get in. They were thinking of opening them from Australia, but then of course things happened in Australia, etc. So you just literally close the borders. In Hong Kong, the borders are closed completely, except they've just opened to Singapore. And in Hong Kong, it's rather more difficult to do that because of the way the Hong Kong economy works and how it works as a hub of those sorts of activities. Whether one thinks it's a desirable way forward in the world to have closed borders for years, because the notion of we just introduced zero COVID and then in 6 months' time there's going to be a vaccine is naive. I mean, there will be some forms of vaccine that will be rolled out. Many of the ones in development aren't sterilizing, so that means they don't actually stop people carrying infection and maybe transmitting it. They just people don't get ill, so they don't push in the same way towards elimination. And the surveys show that a large proportion of people will not take them, will not be vaccinated. In the UK is almost as high as the US in terms of people who won't be vaccinated.
Right.
So that's not going to happen anytime. It's not the virus isn't going to be driven away by vaccination in a few months, as as some of these notions of we've just got to keep it maximally suppressed for a few months and then we'll be fine.
Right. What do we know about the which sections of the population are more vulnerable?
So the biggest driver by far, massively above anything else, is age, as I was saying earlier. So age is just it's difficult to find any condition except dementia which shows a greater age relationship. So that's above everything is age, and that's why the care homes situation in the UK was such a disaster, and Sweden, by the way. And that's why Sweden did badly compared to its Scandinavian neighbours, was partly because of the care home situation. So as you know, in the UK, people were discharged from hospital, elderly people were discharged from hospitals still infected back to care homes. So not shielding care homes was a disaster. So age is the major factor. And then on top of age, There's obviously occupation. I mean, if you're in an occupation, which means that even with people wearing face masks, etc., you're never going to be able to get risk down to zero. So if you're just actually meeting, if you just actually have more contact. So if you're in public transport, if you're a public transport driver, or train conductor or whatever, if you're in those situations, then those jobs and any jobs that are so public are so public facing. And that's why teachers that don't appear to have an increased risk or haven't in the data available so far, which probably reflects the fact that certainly in primary schools there's a low that the primary school kids haven't been in the past infected at high levels. So yes, so quite a lot of jobs, and as sadly one would imagine they're the jobs where the people have the least ability to socially distance. Taxi drivers have had high infection rates, for example. So I mean, for people who can, me, people who can happily largely do their job from home, then that's fine. I mean, if you're on a 0 hours contract and if you actually need to work to feed your kids and you can't work from home, then that obviously increases vulnerability. And then finally, on top of age, men do worse than women across the age spectrum, but particularly as you get into, well, in absolute terms, when you get into older age, and folk of different ethnicity, so Indian subcontinent and Afro-Caribbeans have had increased rates, which partly will be due to occupation, or appears to be due to occupation. There's something of a debate in terms of exactly which factors are involved, but certainly occupation is one of them.
And what do we know about possibly effective measures for shielding the more vulnerable?
Well, yeah. So this is shielding is really difficult. I mean, if you're in an institution where everyone needs to be shielded, which like an old people's home, then at least you know what you've got to do. The sort of hope, and I think it's not an unrealistic hope. The hope is that there will be rapid tests of infections, so antigen tests, test the person actually carrying active virus, where you can be fed, where the results comes in minutes, and then people could be, for example, tested when visiting care homes. So, so one of the inhumane things is, of course, has been the very elderly, often people with cognitive decline, who can't, not understanding why no one's coming to see them, and it's because of there's just forbidden visiting has been forbidden. So testing would hopefully at some stage will become a way of knowing of giving people a passport, if you like, to visit, and the people who work in those locations as well. I mean, the important thing there is it has to be, employment protection, sick pay, etc. You can't expect people who need to work to get by. If they're going to get tested and then they're just made redundant, I mean, that's obviously not something which is fair, sustainable at all. So those levels of protection are needed to allow any of these things, to happen in an equitable manner. And then shielding in the home, again, it's obviously highly dependent on the conditions it's been carried out in. I mean, again, one possibility is if there is this one rapid testing is available, is that if there is an elderly sick person, then people could be tested before seeing them, or regularly have some form of regular testing has been suggested, and that might be possible. Some countries have provided hotel style accommodation for people in those situations.
Right. And finally, what do we know about treatment for those suffering from COVID-19?
So treatments have definitely improved, in particular steroids, dexamethasone, and probably other steroids. And then just the general management, because learning about a new disease has got better, and survival is unequivocally increasing in people who were infected. That's clear. I mean, the other thing we've learned about treatments is why you absolutely need to have randomized controlled trials, do proper studies of these things, and that allowing treatments to be used out with trials on the basis that you're keeping something from people has, of course, been revealed, and that's not really defensible, because some treatments might have detrimental effects. I mean, in the US, I believe well over 100,000 and more convalescent plasma therapies have been used to try and get antibodies across, and it was without any trials. And now, as soon as the trials that have been done have not been positive, not shown that that's a good thing, even though it's highly invasive. You've got all the people making the donations, etc. So, and obviously there's been the hydroxychloroquine fiasco. So the two things I think that have been learned are that some treatments there are now treatments which randomized controlled trials have shown have reasonably large effect sizes. And also we would not have known that without the trials being carried on. I don't think, if at the beginning you'd asked the people who actually know about these things and set the studies up to bet on what was going to turn out to be successful, it wouldn't have been dexamethasone at the top of the list.
Right.
So,
thanks.
So it shows the importance of just doing proper studies to document the treatment. And the UK should be, with a national health service that nearly everyone uses. The UK should be in the pole position, and has been here, as we said, for doing these sorts of studies, because you should have a sort of national level information system which allows you to randomize people to treatments, etc.
Right. Okay. Is there anything else you want to add?
No.
No. Okay. Great. Okay. Thanks a lot.
My mind went blank. That's really good.
Okay.